This is an episode about the crisis of American manhood. I recently rewatched a classic of American cinema, one of the true greats of American film, The Maltese Falcon, and I realized that it and the novel on which it is based are both much more than just fun pop culture or even great pop culture. And I kind of knew this, I guess, in the back of my mind that this was true, but revisiting the movie really kind of inspired me to go back to the novel too and dig deeper into them, because they are both, and the novel especially, pivotal classics for America, but also for America as kind of the, developing vanguard of the West. We don't think of ourselves this way in America all the time, but we talked a little bit about it with Senator Cruz when we had him on, that, because America is our home and we're familiar with it, and also because it is big and brash and comes under a lot of flack, gets a lot of flack, we kind of think of America as this crass, lowbrow place. And I'm going to get into ways in which some elements of that perception might actually be right, but that's largely speaking, it's false to think about America as just this backwater. We are the living tradition of the West. I mean, we are where the greatness of European statesmanship passed all of its wisdom. Our founders looked back to the ancients and to classical political philosophy and classical philosophy, full stop. And the development of our culture is the development of Western culture. So it's a mistake to shrug off America as having nothing to offer to these, high classical traditions. And, we've already done one episode on Gone with the Wind, so you guys know that I'm not averse to or allergic to pop culture. I think the pop culture genuinely matters. And I think that when you start to do a podcast about the West and the great works of the West, everyone kind of assumes you're going to be reading like dusty old scrolls from yon 1500s. But in fact, the West is a living tradition. And as we discussed when we did modernity or modernism rather with Eliot, we can't just wish away the present. We have to be living in the present and paying attention to the present, even as we look back to the past for wisdom. And in America especially, but also in general, being allergic to pop culture or excluding pop culture from discussions about high art is a mistake. It's tempting because so much pop culture, especially right now, is crap, is garbage, and I can guarantee you that we will never have a WAP episode on Young Heretics. There will never be an episode analyzing the opus of Cardi B in depth. However, some pop culture, a considerable amount of pop culture, especially from sort of the golden age of American film and American noir, some pop culture genuinely has something to say about where the West is, about the soul of the West, the soul of of the American soul, and also the kind of more general sort of inheritance of this European Western tradition. There are a few reasons why this is the case. Generally speaking, already, it often turns out that yesterday's folk art and pop art are tomorrow's sort of snobby upper crust culture. So even all this stuff that we now talk about as if it were this high art, this elevated, untouchable thing, one of the things I try to emphasize in this show is that it wasn't always that way. At some point, somewhere down the line, it was just some guy trying to speak to the truth, trying to speak about his experience, what he had encountered in God's world as a creature in that world. And then, it gets kind of put on this pedestal and we kind of think it's unapproachable. But, the example I always give is this musician, Timotheus of Miletus, who's an ancient Greek musician from the 5th century BC, who was reviled by the traditionalists, by the snooty kind of, the Platos of his day, right? Or by actual Plato, who was not just the Plato of his day, but by actual Plato, right? These sort of experimental musicians, Euripides, we talked about in one episode, get reviled. And then, the critics turn around and they suddenly realize, oh, actually, there was something vital and real and important going on outside of our framework for thinking about high art. We thought that high art just looked like this. We had these rules about how it was supposed to be. And these guys came along and broke those rules. And so we kind of sniffed at them and we kicked them out of our, institutions of high culture, or at least we didn't honor them in the way that we honored other people. And now we turn around and we realize they were ahead of the game and we were behind because we were stuck in our kind of snobbery and our old ways. So that happens all the time. You could talk about a million other people. You talk about Theocritus, the poet of the Hellenistic era, this kind of this poet who transforms folk song and the songs of shepherds into high art and into art songs. You even talk about, Homer, right? Looking back to all of the kind of song, the musical tradition and the singing tradition that's gone before him and assembling it into this great art. And this is one of the reasons why, I made fun of Cardi B just a second ago, but it's one of the reasons why I have a lot of time for an interest in developments in things like rap and hip hop music. I'm not like a fan of that kind of stuff, but I do pay attention to it. And I like when Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer Prize, I went out and listened to like a bunch of his stuff because a lot of it's going to be crap, but somewhere in there might actually be this rough cut gem, this thing that over time and with development and curation can enter into the tradition. Now, how do you figure out which of those things are going to be great and which of them are just garbage? Well, it takes time. It takes a lot of judgment. It takes a lot of critical taste and attention. But if you just shrug it all off, if you just sniff at it and say, well, we only read Aristotle on this podcast, well, then I think you are a fool and you end up losing sight of a lot of the great stuff. And you can't demand that art live up to your particular political preferences. This is something that I have to kind of, say to conservatives a lot is, look, Shelley, who was a fantastic poet, was an asshole. Not somebody I would want to hang out with, not somebody whose political ideas I usually agree with, but a great poet who saw some deep truths about the world, saw some things about the pretensions of supposedly great men, who was able to puncture. That poem Ozymandias is a wonderful example of that. And if you simply say, I'm not going to pay attention to this because it doesn't conform to my expectation about what great art looks like, it doesn't conform to my expectation about who makes great art, whatever, yada, 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 you're going to fail. You're going to fail as a critic. You're going to fail as an appreciator of the living tradition of the West. And people like me, who are critics and who are snobs and who love high art and who love the great Western tradition, have to remind ourselves of this, because otherwise you miss what's right in front of your face. And this happens all the time. I think you're seeing it happen right now when the new snobbery is this kind of racialism that has infected Hollywood, and nobody will watch or listen to anything that doesn't speak to these pretensions, these kind of like critical race theory pretensions, this nonsense that's going through the upper classes, because it is the upper classes. It presents itself as this kind of interest in oppressed peoples, but it's really the upperest of the upper crust, who are sniffing their noses down at things like films like American Sniper or A Quiet Place that have traditional values in them, right? If you're that guy, you got to check yourself, right? You got to check your privilege, and you have to look at what people are actually making that they love, because often there is something deep and profound in it. If you ignore this, if you ignore the truth that exists, even in somewhat distasteful forms, in lower class art and pop art, then the art will win and your politics will lose. Andrew Breitbart understood this when he said that politics is downstream from culture. And actually, Shelley said something quite similar. He said the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Plato, in the Laws, talks about a theatrocracy, which is what happens when people make their decisions based on what they see in the theater and what they can applaud at and what people use to pander to them. You may not like it, but art is a tremendously powerful tool. It is more powerful than political argument, than reasoned argument, for insinuating itself into the heart of people. And so the job of critics and the job of people who care about good politics and about preserving the republic have to have a strong stomach for paying attention to the stuff that maybe challenges their presumptions, but can be brought into the system. Because if you just exclude it from the system, then it will tear the system apart. We talked about this with Bacchae and Euripides a little bit. Like, you've got to find some way of seeing what the artists are telling you and then, incorporating that into your bigger vision of the world. Because of course, if the artists are telling you something true, but they don't really see like the whole picture and how people have to live in an ordered society, then you have to kind of find some middle ground between them and balance what the artists are saying with your own, with firmness about, the good traditional values of a free republic and so forth. On top of all of that, right? And all of this is by way of introduction to Dashiell Hammett and the Maltese Falcon, but it's also kind of more important generally for the way that we think about art and culture, right? In America, it's especially important to pay attention to pop art. And the reason for that is that from the beginning, our tradition has been one of rebellion and iconoclasm. At least it has had a strain of that in it. Now, this gets overemphasized, this idea that every revolution is somehow inherently American is ridiculous. The French Revolution was anti-American in many deep and profound ways. But we do have a spirit, an American spirit of gutsy rebellion against the established powers that be. It's how we were able to marshal civilian forces to rise up against the most powerful and bureaucratically competent empire in the world at the time, which was the British Empire. It's how we were able to build our country from the ground up. This belief in the little guy who can shrug off all the old, outdated pieties that are being weaponized against him. Well, you're a threat to monarchic rule if you don't pay our ridiculous taxes, right? That kind of haughty, high and mighty attitude that old institutions get when all they exist to do is just further the power of the people in them, which you see now with people like Dr. Fauci and all the lockdown is science crew. If you don't wear a mask, you're against science. You're against the great God of science. That attitude is something that we must cultivate resistance to at an emotional level, at a level of just being able to say, you know what, get stuffed, right? I mean, that is the American spirit. And there is a tension between that spirit and the very real necessity for law and order, for respecting tradition, for trying to build up our institutions and trying to respect our traditions. In the end, what Americans say is, in the last analysis, our rights come from God, not the institutions. So if the institutions infringe upon our rights, then up yours, right? But if they don't, then, we need to build them up and we need to care about them. And so there has always existed this tension between this spirit that lives on the outside and opposes order and opposes the institutions, and the spirit that believes in the institutions and comes from the older tradition of the old world and European order and so forth. The true piety, which forms the backbone of American life, is also, a kind of order and a kind of respect. But you also need, and this is a thing that the Roman Republic was very good at as well, you need this kind of homespun dignity. You need this sense that the true source of elevation and dignity is in the household, with the family, with the little guy who can run his house the way he wants to run his house. And you have to incorporate that into your institutions in order to be truly and genuinely American. That balance is something we've really lost, I think. This very tension is reflected in our art, this tension between respect for the old traditions and that fire of rebellion that says, you know what, if you're going to step on me, I'm going to punch you in the nose. That fire of rebellion. The tension between the two things exists in our art as well. Think about our great American artists, Mark Twain, right? Herman Melville, Ernest Hemingway, Walt Whitman, Stephen Sondheim, these guys, Rodgers and Hammerstein, right? All of them are very careful literary or musical, in some cases, artists, conscious of their craft, attentive to detail. And yet all of them have an interest in the average dude. All of them care about kind of folksy stories, care about people living in the country. I mean, and even people like Faulkner and Steinbeck, who have kind of an elevated style, right? Or Fitzgerald, who writes about high society sometimes. Their attitudes can be a little bit more patrician, but they still hold that intention with this very realist attention to detail and attention to, what's underneath the high society, what's behind it, who's on the outs of it, right? Mark Twain is a great example. This was Walt Whitman, right? What's the real earthy spirit in the American countryside that defies the powers that be? And so all of this means that in some sense, our pop art is our high art, and our high art is pop art. And so when you got to thinking about American art, you have to think about it in a slightly different way than you think about European art, which is much more, I think, speaking very, very generally here, right, much more invested in its traditions, much more invested in the legitimacy of its honors. And now that all of our, credentializing institutions have gone to pot, right, the Oscars, who now believe you have to have like a certain racial quota met in order to be considered for the Best Picture, and the New York Times, which puts only leftists on its bestseller list, or at least, does everything it can to keep conservatives off. Now that all of these people are absolute crap and like cuties, this sort of terribly exploitative film about young girls is getting awards at Sundance, and the National Book Award is going to like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kendi, these people who are like just pure ridiculous racialists who hate America, right? All of that is such crap that we have to sort of develop our own attention to where art is and where the great art is, even if it's in places that aren't being honored and celebrated in the high halls of power, right? Whenever institutions fail, art goes elsewhere. I mean, this is kind of the great lesson of these transitional periods like the one we're in now. visual art, painting, is like all but dead, but visual arts have moved to video games. Play God of War, right? Play Ico. Play, these great classics of video games, and you will see where the visual art has gone. Final Fantasy, all of these incredibly imaginative landscapes and dreamscapes, right? Where has music gone? Stephen Limbaugh talked with us about it, right? It's gone into movies. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one of the great works of American pop culture and treat it seriously as a work of high art, because I believe that is what it is, and I think actually it has something incredibly profound to say about manhood in the West and the beginnings of the crisis of manhood that we are now seeing in the present day. Let's get into it. First of all, though, let me thank you so much for listening. It's great to be here with you. If you have never heard or seen the show before, thanks for joining us. If you haven't yet, subscribe. Click subscribe wherever you are, iTunes, Google, whatever, we're everywhere. And you'll get new episodes every week. And then if you want to tell people about it, that's what really helps us out. You can give us a 5-star review on iTunes, and you can send it to your friends, send it to your family, send it to anyone you know that might care about the stuff we talk about here and benefit from these episodes. Thanks again for listening. Let's talk about the Maltese Falcon. Now, the Maltese Falcon is one of the great detective novels, detective stories. And in keeping with the mood of that, I usually drink coffee while I make this show. But in keeping with the mood of that, I'm drinking a good tumbler of scotch here, a good tumbler of whiskey, because that's what all the characters in this movie and this novel drink. I'm drinking Monkey Shoulder, which is probably not what they were drinking. It's a Scotch blend. I really like it. People ask me all the time what my favorite whiskey is. This is the only blend really that I will drink, and they didn't pay me to say that. So drink up, me hearties, if you're at home, and let's get talking about Dashiell Hammett and the Maltese Falcon. Here's something you might not know, even if you know about Hammett. You know about detective novels generally in America. This novel, and it's not alone in this, this novel began as a serialized novel. That is, it was released in sections in a magazine, a pulp magazine called Black Mask. And it began to appear in Black Mask, Hammett's Falcon did, in 1929. This used to be one of the central ways that great novels would be published. I mean, Charles Dickens, all of his novels were serialized, and people would wait for the next installment in them as they got shipped, out across the empire. Black Mask is a kind of is a pulp magazine that did this with novels like Hammett, like the Maltese Falcon, and it began in 1920, so that's kind of the era that we're at now. And then it would, these things would eventually get released as full books, sort of collated into one giant thing, but you'd get kind of chapters at a time. Black Mask was founded in 1920 by H.L. Mencken, big name in this field, in the field of literary arts, and George Jean Nathan is the other founder. It was one of the greats, right? It published all kinds of great novelists, and the history of Black Mask is a perfect little parable because of what we're talking about, because it was founded in order to support a literary magazine called Smart Set. And Smart Set, which was more kind of frou-frou and pompous and erudite, wasn't solvent. It wasn't making money. And so they founded this other magazine so that people would buy it. And they'd use that money to fund Smart Set. And so what happened is the money-making venture, the kind of crass money-making venture, is where these true American greats are writing Dashiell Hammett. And this happens all the time. It's a great example of, pop art not getting the respect that it deserves while it actually is the meat and potatoes of stuff. A good example of this is Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, right? And really wanted to write history and other stuff and didn't really like Holmes that much. He thought he was just writing it to support him. But of course, all anybody remembers Arthur Conan Doyle for is Sherlock Holmes. And so this is a kind of a similar situation here. And Hammett, who is writing along with, at the same time as Raymond Chandler in this era, is really, these two are the kind of twin titans of this genre, of the hard-boiled detective novel. Now, there are others. First of all, there are predecessors to the detective novel. Dostoevsky is one, right? The Crime and Punishment in the 19th century. Wilkie Collins, who's an English writer, writes The Moonstone and Women in White. Is kind of looked back upon as originators of this tradition. And then, of course, Hammett and Chandler have other contemporaries. James M. Cain is a great one. Check out The Postman Always Rings Twice. It's really good. But to me, the detective novel reaches its, what would you call it? It's apogee, right? It's just absolute height as a genre with Hammett and Chandler. And it is a quintessentially American genre. It's perfected in America. Something about America is the perfect setting for it. And interestingly, both Hammett and Chandler write about California, which for some reason, I always just reflexively imagine their novels taking place on the East Coast. But actually, they take place in California. In San Francisco, especially, the Maltese Falcon takes place in San Francisco. It actually makes sense because it's sort of on a par with the Western, right? It's this thing that happens out in the Wild West. And it obviously, takes the detective novels take place at a later, more kind of industrialized time than the West does, when there's truly this lawless space where, men have to make their name and assert law and assert order kind of their own will. But this is almost, on some level, this is the version of that takes place in a later kind of urban setting. And the parallel to like the cowboy or the Western gunman is the private eye, the private dick, right? And that's who these characters are. Hammett's Sam Spade, and Raymond Chandler, the Marlowe novels, Philip Marlowe. These guys are just outside the law. They aren't doing anything illegal, per se, in their profession, but they do have to be willing to get down and dirty and to break the rules sometimes to get to what's good, right? And this is why I raised the kind of Euripides conundrum that we talked about on that episode, that sometimes artists have to look beyond the rules of their genre to see the truth and express it in a new form. And sometimes, sometimes good men have to look beyond the formalized rules of their society in order to see what's right. And this is a theme, as I've said, in American art. A great kind of localization of that is in Huckleberry Finn, in Mark Twain's Huck Finn, where Huck is freeing a slave. He's helping a slave to escape. And he knows this is right, but everyone has told him he's going to hell, because his whole society teaches him, according to the rules, that if you do this, you've stolen and you've done evil and you're going to hell. And he says, all right, then, I'll go to hell, right? That's that American spirit of revolution that says, I see a good that the law is not expressing. The law is actually, in this case, doing quite wrong. And often in detective novels, it's not even that the law is evil. It's that the law is a slow-moving, clunky machine, right? These characters that appear, the policemen, the judges, these institutional figures of law and order, are often good guys that show up, but they're kind of slow. And the lone man, the lone gunman working alone can do better and can get things faster and quicker and is slicker than the actual kind of instruments of the state. And so this is another version, a central way of expressing this paradox, this American paradox. We've always recognized that even though law has a legitimacy, which it derives ultimately at a couple removes from God, humans being what they are, that law is never a perfect description of God's will in any situation, even in great society. And what is truly good sometimes stands outside of the law. And so that was the recognition that existed at our founding, in the revolution. And it is a recognition that we've puzzled over ever since in our art. If once you recognize this phenomenon, you find it everywhere. I just mentioned it in Twain, but it's everywhere. The sense that like our heroes are people. One of the reasons that we're kind of into the bad boy, that we have so many anti-heroes, Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, right, is that we have this sense that sometimes good guys act outside of the law or have to reach beyond the law to the good. And Sam Spade is like essentially that guy. And so to some degree is Philip Marlowe, who is Raymond Chandler's character. But this is why I bring them up in comparison to one another, because they have very different visions of who this person is who has to act outside the law. Chandler basically says the guy that acts outside the law has to be impeccable. And his model for this is the chivalric knight, the knight of, the round table. And often Marlowe is depicted, up against stained glass images of knights, and a lot of that imagery recurs in Chandler's novels now, not Hammett. And Chandler wrote about this in an essay in The Atlantic in 1944, famous essay called The Simple Art of Murder. And he talks about what a man has to do in order to keep order in an orderless or a corrupt society. He says, "Down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He is the hero. He is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. He must be, to use a rather weathered phrase, a man of honor, by instinct, by inevitability, without thought of it, and certainly without saying it. He must be the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world. He will take no man's money dishonestly, and no man's insolence without a due and dispassionate revenge. He is a lonely man, and his pride is that you will treat him as a proud man, or be very sorry you ever saw him. The story is this man's adventure in search of a hidden truth, and it would be no adventure if it did not happen to a man fit for adventure. If there were enough like him, the world would be a very safe place to live in, without being too dull to be worth living in." Oof, I need a drink of whiskey after that. That's very good. It's a wonderful essay. And you see his vision of this guy, right? Now, you note that he is... he's in some sense the Chandlerian hero is a fearsome figure. He's somebody that you wouldn't want to cross or mess with. And he's not somebody that you could, imagine would just be like a softie. But he's impeccable in his morals and in his ethics. And Hammett says something totally different. He says, in the real world, in order to be that guy, you have to be kind of a tough. And Sam Spade, who is the main character of this novel, the Maltese Falcon, is that tough guy. He's like, it's set up wonderfully in the first page of the novel. So I'll just read that now. It's such a great opening. And Hammett makes totally clear who this person is. In chapter 1, Spade and Archer. Samuel Spade's jaw was long and bony, his chin a jutting V under the more flexible V of his mouth. His nostrils curved back to make another smaller V. His yellow-gray eyes were horizontal. The V motif was picked up again by thickish brows rising outward from twin creases above a hooked nose, and his pale brown hair grew down from high, flat temples in a point on his forehead. He looked, rather pleasantly, like a blonde Satan. He said to Effie Perrin, "Yes, sweetheart?" She was a lanky, sunburned girl whose tan dress of thin woolen stuff clung to her with an effect of dampness. Her eyes were brown and playful in a shiny, boyish face. She finished shutting the door behind her, leaned against it, and said, "There's a girl wants to see you. Her name's Wonderly." "A customer?" "I guess so. You'll want to see her anyway. She's a knockout." "Sure in, darling," said Spade. "Sure in." It's so good. And it's all like that. This is the prose. Hammett's prose is wonderful and very kind of tight and clear. And you get immediately who this guy is, right? It looks like a blonde Satan. And he bursts onto the scene. It's like, this is the American bad boy, right? We've seen this character so many times. And in fact, some of our more recent hits on TV, like Breaking Bad, are about a normal person turning into that guy and the moral ambiguity of that and the way that that guy can go terribly wrong and terribly astray. So all of that is just contained here in Hammett's vision of who the guy has to be that's going to walk the mean streets that Chandler refers to. It's very different from the knight. It's somebody much scrappier, somebody willing to bend the rules a lot more. And that vision would be kind of translated into the movie, which came out in 1941. And the movie essentially is often credited with inventing the genre that we call film noir, or at least with kind of kicking off its major prominence. What is film noir? Well, it's, dark, slanting shots, harsh shadows, tough-talking, tough guys. Later greats in this genre include like Orson Welles movies, right? The Third Man, which comes out in 1949, and The Touch of Evil, 1958. And later on, this genre then becomes one of the hallmarks of American film. 1974, you have Chinatown, and even something like Blade Runner, 1982, is kind of a play on the noir genre. And one of the things that the Maltese Falcon, the movie Maltese Falcon, doesn't have that later becomes a staple of noir is the voiceover, right? The tough guy voiceover. And there was a debate when they made Blade Runner about whether they were going to have one or not. Basically, the studio execs put one in. And it fits into this genre, but it doesn't exist in the Maltese Falcon. But a lot of this other stuff does. The kind of, this very spare but also dramatic lighting and this black and white kind of, literally in the case of this movie, right, this black and white color palette and this, fast talking tough guy. The movie Maltese Falcon is directed by John Huston. And he and the star, Humphrey Bogart, worked together for 6 movies. So they had this very productive relationship. Huston was this ball of energy, and Bogart, he could draw out of Bogart his best performances. And actually, Bogart had been kind of a nothing until this point, being like kind of a B-list actor. And this film made him into who he is. And Huston said that the camera kind of drew out of Bogart something more than he was in person. And so he is, even though he looks nothing like the description that I just read, right? Bogart is Sam Spade. You can't watch the movie and then not hear his voice in your head when you read the novel. And another kind of dimension of this, of creating this genre, is Arthur Edison, who's the cinematographer. And he really likes European films. He's interested in like German Impressionism, which probably not a lot of people watch German Impressionist movies anymore, but like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a good example of this, which is stuff that doesn't quite make sense narratively, but has some of that same drama, those sort of interesting angles, those arresting shots. Yeah. And what's interesting about this moment in film history is that there is a huge influx of European talent coming into America for a bunch of reasons. America is on the up. America is industrializing at a rapid pace and is a land of great opportunity, but also Jews are fleeing Germany, right? And one of the actors in this movie, Peter Lorre, who is he's a Hungarian American, I guess, and he's this skeevy little European guy with a funny accent. Hello, Mr. Spade. Hello. That's he was big already. He was in Fritz Lang's M, and he was in Hitchcock, The Man Who Knew Too Much. The Maltese Falcon, directed by John Huston, who became a huge director with this movie and worked with the star Humphrey Bogart in 6 other movies. So Bogart and he became this dynamic duo. Huston had this incredible energy to him that Bogart was really kind of admired and was fed off of, essentially. And in some senses, Huston made Bogart too. Bogart was kind of not as big a deal at the time until he was in this movie, and then he really basically took off as a star. And Huston knew how to draw out of Bogart kind of more than he was in person. He said the camera draws something out of Bogey that I don't see in him as a normal person. And so this film, in many ways, made both of them. Bogart is Sam Spade, even though he looks nothing like, right, the description that I just read from the novel. Bogart is Sam. You can't read the novel without hearing his voice after you've seen the movie. And there's just something incredibly dynamic about him. The other guy that's important here and doesn't get talked about quite as much is Arthur Edison, who's the cinematographer of the movie. And so a lot of those shots that became classic film noir shots, those kind of angled shots, those slanting shadows, right? Those are from him. And he was very much influenced by European film and by kind of German Impressionism. So this is this, Impressionist films are ones in which like the movie doesn't quite make sense, but you're very riveted by the imagery and this kind of eerie sense of the supernatural and the occult. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari would be a good example of like one of those movies. And in general, at this point, there's this huge influx of European talent into America, the old world coming to the new world. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. One of them is, of course, that America is on the up. It's industrializing. It's a land of great opportunity. It's very rapidly becoming an economic powerhouse. But on the other hand, also Jews are fleeing from Germany. And Peter Lorre, who's another big name in this movie, who's already kind of a star. He'd been in M, which is a famous film by Fritz Lang, and Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much. Peter Lorre is this kind of skeevy little European guy. Hello, Mr. Spade. He has that funny voice. And he was a Hungarian who began his career kind of in Berlin, and then he fled and came eventually to America. And this movie, did a lot to increase his reputation too. And so it's this collaboration between these up and coming American stars of film, right? Huston and Bogart, and Edison also, who made something that was heavily influenced by the old world, but was distinctly American. Film noir is distinctly American, at least in this iteration. And, one of the things that people said when Huston became big was, we found our Hitchcock, right? Hitchcock's British, of course. And so we found our guy who can do that. And so this is an interesting moment, I think, for America, in some sense, taking the mantle from Europe as Europe self-destructs in the periods of the two wars, right? So this is what's intriguing about this is that forming something uniquely American does not mean a complete break with the old world, right? It does not mean tossing aside the history of Europe and the artistic traditions of Europe. It means standing in relation to the old world and seeing, all that is great about it, watching it fall away and incorporating it into the unique challenges and interests of an American audience and an American film crew. So that's what's interesting about the making of the movie, but it's also what's interesting about the plot of the Maltese Falcon. The plot itself is about kind of what happens when old world sensibilities make their way, flee almost into America and meet up with the kind of immovable object of the American tough guy. The Maltese Falcon in the title, as we eventually learn, this is, by the way, from here on out, a lot of spoilers. So be aware that, this movie with a lot of twists and turns, a book with a lot of twists and turns. And if you don't want spoilers, then you should go listen to it, or you should go watch it and read the book. But it's still good, even if you already know what happens. So I will now tell you, that the Maltese Falcon in the title is this priceless artifact that has been missing from the misty pasts of Europe. It's kind of gone missing from the old world. And it's based on a true story, a true historical fact, which is that the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, who were not initially crusaders, but were this kind of band of hospitallers, as they're sometimes called the Hospitallers, or the Hospitallers. In the 11th century, they set up a hospital dedicated to caring for pilgrims in the Holy Land. So this is the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. And they're kind of sometimes they're compared in the novel with the Knights Templar. They're this old band of holy warriors and holy knights. And during the Holy Wars, they basically ended up forced out into this island, Malta, which is this island south of Sicily. And it was rented to them by the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. That's from 1530 onward. They're renting this island from Charles V, but all they have to pay in rent is one peregrine falcon a year. And so there's a falconry there, and they send him a falcon every year as tribute of their gratitude. Hammett makes up this story, which is that in the Crusades, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem basically accrued vast, untold wealth. And they were so grateful to Charles V that they decided for their first falcon, they were going to send him this jewel-encrusted statue of a falcon of untold wealth. And Spade gets kind of roped into this quest to find this falcon, which goes missing, but then kind of reappears and is hunted down by this guy, Caspar Gutman, the fat man, played in the movie by Sidney Greenstreet, this sort of big, jowly British person, British accent. And they have this wonderful set of interactions in which Gutman kind of explains what's going on here. It's worth reading. So I will now read from the chapter entitled The Emperor's Gift. It says, have you any conception of the extreme, the immeasurable wealth of the order at that time? And Spade says, if I remember, they were pretty well fixed. Gutman smiled indulgently. Pretty well, sir, is putting it mildly. His whisper became lower and more purring. They were rolling in wealth, sir. You've no idea. None of us has any idea. For years they had preyed on the Saracens, had taken nobody knows what spoils of gems, precious metals, silks, ivories, the cream of the East. That is history, sir. We all know that the holy wars to them, as to the Templars, were largely a matter of loot. Well now, the Emperor Charles has given them Malta, and all the rent he asks is one insignificant bird per annum, just as a matter of form. What could be more natural than for these immeasurably wealthy knights to look around for some way of expressing their gratitude? Well, sir, that's exactly what they did, and they hit on the happy thought of sending Charles for the first year's tribute, not an insignificant live bird, but a glorious golden falcon encrusted from head to foot with the finest jewels in their coffers. And remember, sir, they had fine ones, the finest out of Asia. Gutman stopped whispering. His sleek, dark eyes examined Spade's face, which was placid. The fat man asked, well, sir, what do you think of that? I don't know. The fat man smiled complacently. So this is a wonderful kind of swashbuckling story, which all takes place as kind of narrated in the background of this. But it is this story out of the high period of European heroism, right? The great misty, distant past of Europe that makes its way to San Francisco as a result of this kind of crime that, or the series of crimes that people are committing in order to get at the Maltese Falcon, which we'll get to in a bit. But Fat Man smiled complacently. He said, "These are facts. facts, historical facts, not schoolbook history, not Mr. Wells' history, but history nonetheless. The archives of the order from the 12th century are still at Malta. They are not intact, but what there is holds no less than 3 references that can't be to anything else but this jeweled falcon. And so it disappears for a time. So that's the story. That's what happens. And essentially, the falcon disappears for a time. It reappears in Constantinople. Gutman sends this woman, who we eventually will learn is Bridget O'Shaughnessy, this beautiful woman, to recover it. She brings along Joel Cairo, who's Peter Lorre's character, this kind of skeevy little accomplice, who, by the way, it's made clear in the novel and less clear, but still clear in the movie that he's gay. And they have there's this weird thing going on between him and Wilmer, who's the Gutman's hired gun. And this was during the Hays Code, which is a sort of a period of semi-enforced self-censorship by filmmakers. So you couldn't be as sort of saucy and sexy as the novel is. The novel is incredibly sexy. And so the movie's very suggestive, which is kind of interesting difference between the two of them. But in any case, they Cairo and O'Shaughnessy and another accomplice, Thursby, are kind of trying to get this falcon. O'Shaughnessy and Thursby flee. And Gutman sort of, with Cairo, is chasing down after the falcon. In the end, and this is real spoiler alert, right? It turns out that both the falcon is fake, that they have. It's not the real falcon. And O'Shaughnessy, Bridget O'Shaughnessy, who's gone at this point by a million different names, lied to Sam Spade, has tried to play Spade. She came to Spade telling him a fake story to lure his partner Miles Archer away. The opening of the movie, opening of the book, she has Archer come, this fake story that she needs protection. She's trying to track down her sister. It's this whole thing. And Archer is killed. What she was actually doing, it turns out, she killed Archer, and then Wilmer, who is this hired gun, killed Thursby. And Wilmer ends up getting taken in for killing Thursby. But she, who has killed Archer she was basically what she was trying to do is to shake Thursby, because Thursby, she wanted the falcon all for herself. And so she's kind of overcome by greed. She wants the falcon all for herself. Someone has to go in for the killing of Archer. And the great climactic scene is that Sam Spade, who over the course of this time, right, has been lied to by O'Shaughnessy, and he just cuts through all of her lies. He's such a straight talker that he just doesn't take any of her lies. And the climactic moment, he's kind of fallen in love with her. There's incredible chemistry. And by the way, I actually don't think that the movie's so fast, it doesn't quite get at it. But that in the novel, it's absolutely heartbreaking that he basically has to give her up to the police, and it's a choice between basically telling the truth once he's found out that she's this murderer, and basically going off, running away with her, and starting a new life of crime and seeking after the falcon and hunting down this priceless treasure. So that's bare bones. There's I've said that, I've told that story in such a way as not to give away all of the spoilers. So there's still stuff that you don't know, but there are some themes that I want to explore here that really speak to the heart of kind of what this movie and this book is about, I think. And that one of them is this idea about being a straight talker and telling the truth versus being a deceiver. So the great deceiver, the great sort of femme fatale liar is Bridget O'Shaughnessy, is the woman. And what's so alluring about her is that she has this kind of facade of vulnerability, but she's actually the great criminal mastermind, right? She's running loops around everybody. And Spade's the only person who can kind of keep up with her. And so they have this incredible dynamic. But there's an interesting similar dynamic with Gutman and Spade. So I'm going to read now the scene from the beginning, not from the beginning, but the beginning of their relationship when they first meet, in a chapter called The Fat Man. And he says, okay, so Gutman sits down and says, "Now, sir, we'll talk if you like. And I'll tell you right out that I'm a man who likes talking to a man that likes to talk." Spade says, "Swell. Will we talk about the blackbirds?" At this point, he wants to know about the Maltese Falcon, but he doesn't know everything about it. The fat man laughed, and his bulbs rose up and down on his laughter. "Will we?" he asked. And "We will," he replied. His pink face was shiny with delight. "You're the man for me, sir. A man cut along my own lines. No beating about the bush, but right to the point. Will we talk about the blackbird?" "We will. I like that, sir. I like that way of doing business. Let us talk about the blackbird by all means. But first, sir, answer me a question, please, though maybe it's an unnecessary one, so we'll understand each other from the beginning. You're here as Miss O'Shaughnessy's representative." Spade blew smoke above the fat man's head in a long, slanting plume. He frowned thoughtfully at the ash-tipped end of his cigar. He replied deliberately, I can't say yes or no. There's nothing certain about it either way yet. He looked up at the fat man and stopped frowning. It depends. It depends on... Spade shook his head. If it knew what it depends on, I could say yes or no. The fat man took a mouthful from his glass, swallowed it, and suggested, maybe it depends on Joel Cairo? Spade's prompt. Maybe was non-committal. He drank. So this is this incredible interaction between the two of them where Spade is trying to get information. He's quite above board about that. He keeps pressing for information about the blackbird. Gutman, all he does, and there's more to it than just that scene that piece of the scene that I read, right? Gutman just keeps saying, oh yes, I like a man that likes to talk. You're very forthright. You really get to the point. Now, let me ask you this other question that's completely unrelated. This incredible dodge, this dance of the seven veils, this duck and weave, of this kind of sophisticated, elegant, purring, well-fed criminal. And he's a criminal. And this, on the other hand, this kind of rough and tumble, down and dirty, straightforward American man. It's this picture of elite old world society versus this scrappy new world renegade, right? And the pretense of sophistication against this unsophisticated man who is complicated, but ultimately the good guy, right? He's the only person in the end who's going to stand on his principle. And the epitome of that is this sort of final interaction, this interrelation between him and O'Shaughnessy, when she, finally it all comes clear that she herself has killed Archer, and she has to she has to pay for it, essentially. Spade is faced with this choice, right? Is he, like everybody else, going to do anything for this blackbird and for his desire, which is for her, right? For his kind of passion for her. And he's just seen Gutman sell out Wilmer to have him be the fall guy and, go to jail, and worse, probably, because he so desires the bird, right? And Gutman starts out by saying, Wilmer's like a son to me. And then he, throws him to the dogs. And so this is the famousest part. This is the real famous part. Like Hammett puts Spade in this situation where he has to either become Gutman, become this kind of old world sophisticate running after these sort of high dreams and this crazy adventure and this passionate love affair, or he's got to turn in the woman he loves. So here's the interaction between them. All we've got is the fact that maybe you love me and maybe I love you. You know, she whispered, whether you do or not. I don't. It's easy enough to be nuts about you. He looked hungrily from her hair to her feet and then up to her eyes again. But I don't know what that amounts to. Does anybody ever? But suppose I do. What of it? Maybe next month I won't. I've been through it before, when it lasted that long. Then what? Then I'll think I played the sap. And if I did it and got sent over, then I'd be sure I was the sap. Well, if I send you over, I'll be sorry as hell. I'll have some rotten nights, but that'll pass. Listen. He took her by the shoulders and bent her back, leaning over her. If that doesn't mean anything to you, forget it and we'll make it this. I won't because all of me wants to. Wants to say to hell with the consequences and do it. And because, God damn you, you've counted on that with me, the same as you counted on that with the others. He took his hands from her shoulders and let them fall to his sides. She put her hands up to his cheeks and drew his face down again. Look at me, she said, and tell me the truth. If the Falcon had been real and you had been paid your money, what difference does that make now? Don't be too sure I'm as crooked as I'm supposed to be. That kind of reputation might be good business, bringing in high-priced jobs and making it easier to deal with the enemy. She looked at him, saying nothing. He moved his shoulders a little and said, well, a lot of money would have been at least one more item on the other side of the scales. She put her face up to his face. Her mouth was slightly open, with lips a little thrust out. She whispered, if you loved me, you'd need nothing more on that side. Spade set the edges of his teeth together and said through them, I won't play the sap for you. She put her mouth to his, slowly, her arms around him, and came into his arms. She was in his arms when the doorbell rang, and she gets picked up by the cops. This is, to me, a little crucible of this crisis, this difficulty in which, the American tough guy finds him. And to me, the center of it, the great line is, don't think I'm as crooked as I'm supposed to be, right? Or don't think I'm as crooked as I'm supposed to be. This wonderful line, right? That he's got this reputation for being outside the law, and he does do things that are, he's tempted to things that are wrong, and he does do things that are morally questionable. But what he's not is crooked. He's not actually there. He's always looking toward the right thing to do, or at least the good thing to do. He's trying to catch the bad guy. He's trying to do the job that he was, given to do. And this tension, all of the desire, the sort of seductive desire of going with her, and just throwing it all to the winds, and being the person that people probably think he is, right? Just being the guy that just follows his appetites, versus not playing the sap for her, right? Versus just refusing to be taken in by all of that. That is the quintessence of American manhood. And that the thing about it is, right, that there's no way to put into words or rules what the law is that the American good guy has to follow, right? The quintessence of it is to seek the thing that the law is there to do, which is to bring about the good. But sometimes the law fails, and you have to do the thing that is, just harder than following that is better than following the law, and harder, and take the heat for it. Take the heat for pursuing the good, even beyond what your society tells you should do, or what the law tells you should do. And that's why you can't put this into rules or say exactly what it is, because by its nature, it has to do with yearning for something that can't fully be expressed in any legal system. In Man of La Mancha, which is the kind of American musical based on Don Quixote, the great novel, there's this line in the song The Impossible Dream, right? To be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. That's the same thing. And once you recognize this, you look everywhere in American art and you see it. And our current obsession with the bad boy, right, with Sopranos and Breaking Bad that I've mentioned now a couple times, is even deeper into that predicament. It has to do with the fact that, for Spade and for some of these great American tough guys, this problem is only kind of marginal, because generally the system works, right? The American legal system is a good one, and there are just these kind of edge cases where they have to, push at the edges of it. For us, the institutions are crumbling around us, right? And more, the public schools and even in some cases, the court are just saying these things that are absolutely bonkers. I mean, take this James Younger case, right? The case of the father in Texas who's, the mother wants to take the boy away because she thinks he's like a girl, basically, wants to give him hormone therapy and all this stuff. And I've seen people on Twitter, and I don't blame them, saying that's when, if I'm that father, that's when I get my gun, And the more the state goes insane, the more all of manhood consists in this terrible choice between lawless good and lawful evil, right? And that's why we're in this crisis. I mean, take Kyle Rittenhouse, right? The guy who traveled to Kenosha to sort of try and keep some semblance of order during the riots there. He's now, he's up against the state. He's being prosecuted for having shot what I think looks to me like shooting in self-defense. But it's a terrible thing to do to men, to put them into this predicament where in order to be men and to be virtuous, they have to be outlaws. And a country which does this to men, as we discussed when we talked about the Gracchi in Rome, a country which does this to its men en masse will not survive long. And so this is something we've got to, fix, basically, or die. America, which in its spirit is the spirit of the righteous rebel, has now become the established behemoth whose formalized rules are the kind of outdated, sclerotic, institutional oppressors that Americans once rebelled against in the form of the British Empire, and then again and again, right, throughout our history. And in the Maltese Falcon, that authority, though, comes from the old world, right? It's this kind of double dealing, this corruption hidden under a veneer of civilization. And what's so disheartening to me about our current American situation is that America's institutions are starting to look like that. They're starting to have all the trappings of authority and righteousness and legitimacy, and in fact to be these dead, zombified husks, basically. And so our challenge and my prayer is that to reverse those trends, right? To go back to an America where, men have a place, a central place in institutional American society. But if not, right, Sam Spade becomes our hero. Sam, in the end, we remain, in the spirit of that Protestant, that Protestant ethic that says, you know what, all right, if the world tells me I'm going to hell, but I can see what God's will is, I will go to hell. This gives me hope because no matter what America, the elite establishment becomes, Americans will always be that Sam Spade, that Huck Finn, that revolutionary spirit. And God bless us and God bless Americans. Okay, that's the end of this episode on the Maltese Falcon. I'm going to take a drink and then do the mailbag. So I had a question about this very phenomenon, which is how do you discern when you are breaking the rules for a good cause and when you're just breaking them because you want to? And as I've said in this episode, the answer kind of is like, you just have to discern it, in prayer, basically. But I will evoke one other passage from a text we've already worked with, which is The Abolition of Man, in which Lewis, you remember, talks about the Tao. And this is the moral way, the moral law, the kind of universal moral law that we can intuit, even if we can't say with exactness what it is in every case. And this is true in, this person was asking about art, asking about Euripides and breaking the rules of a genre, the conventions of a genre. But art imitates life, and the conventions of a genre have some of the same behavior as moral conventions in a society. And in both cases, what Lewis says is that the changes that are made to the Tao, the developments that occur in the Tao, this moral way, are like trees naturally growing new branches. And you can tell because they are in the direction of the original thing. So, for example, he gives the example of, thou shalt not kill and do no harm and things of that nature. Get advanced in Jesus to do unto others, the positive command, do unto others as you would have done unto you. And you can see naturally how that emerges like a branch growing out of a tree. And he quotes Keats, Lewis does, talking about the poet who has been well nurtured in his mother tongue. Once you've learned the rules of English so well, then you can become a poet by breaking the rules in productive ways. But it's only once you know the rules, only once you're thoroughly versed in what the traditions and the kind of sound craftsmanship of your field is, that you can discern when that, when the truth and when the good are trying to push their way outside into something new. I hope that answers the question, even though there is no final answer to it because it's always a practice of discernment. Thanks, as always, for listening to this episode. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on Young Heretics. If you like this show, you will love the work that we do at the Claremont Institute with the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books, where I'm the assistant editor. Please do go check them out, check us out, and donate at claremont.org/donate if you feel inspired. Mention in the notes that you heard about it through Young Heretics. All right. Thanks again. We will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.